Hello, my name is Emily Swanson. I am the president and owner of Holy Cow Consulting. We are based out of Columbus, Ohio, but have worked with over 3,000 congregations. Over 2,200 of those have been in the last 7 years. So we get to travel all over, though not right now because of the coronavirus, and meet lots of people. But sometimes the best way to review the data with the congregation is to have a recording like this with me going through the data with you on a PowerPoint and talking about the results of your congregation assessment tool. And so that's what we're going to be doing today with this PowerPoint. So today we're going to be talking about your congregation assessment tool that you took for Westminster Presbyterian Church in Topeka, Kansas. I was in Topeka with your leadership a few weeks ago, though so much has changed. I'm recording this on March 30th, and we're all in various states of shelter in place across the country. And I did want to say I'm wishing you all good health and safety, and that you're able to take care of each other and create meaningful connections, even though we have to socially distance. So I want to talk about a few things before I get started today. The first is we're going to be talking a lot in my presentation about benchmarking. We benchmarked your congregation against 2,200 other congregations that have taken the congregation assessment tool in the last 7 years. And the reason we benchmark is because we understand things in our lives by benchmarking. When we walk into a restaurant and see how the service is there or how clean it is, that's benchmarking because we've seen other restaurants that are also the same way or significantly worse. When we walk into a group or someone's home, we can tell if we're welcomed or not just because of that second that we're experiencing that, but because we've been welcomed in other places and we've probably also been invited into situations that haven't felt as welcoming. And so benchmarking you against these other congregation takes us out of that insulated view and guesswork of, gosh, is this how this is supposed to feel? And if 45% agree with this, what does that mean? And instead, it tells us what's exceptional and typical about who you all are at Westminster. The other thing I'm going to ask is that we go through the data, you listen to it empathetically. These responses may not have been your responses. You might have answered the questions differently. But when folks sat down in your congregation, they all brought their own stories and their own experiences and answered the questions with those. And so this is a collective response of what your congregation is saying together. And so it's important to listen empathetically, even though we might feel like that's not quite our experience. We have to remember that a congregation is a body of Christ. So how we all experience things together is extremely important. I want to say that when you think about why you are part of Westminster and you kind of think back to when you became a member or when you first attended, why are you a part of this congregation? You don't have to be. You could pick another congregation to be a part of, but for some reason, this was the congregation that you have agreed to be a part of. And we have to always think about that why. Why are you a part of this congregation? And why is this where God has you right now? And that why is in that center there, and that's your purpose or what you believe. And as a congregation, we have to have these things that are our whys, our truths. Is it because we have a healthy community with each other? Is it because we're building stronger spiritual basis for our lives? Is it because we feel like we're doing really good work in ministry together? So what is your why? And you can have a few of them and they become kind of your core values, the things we want to pay attention to. Your how is specific actions taken to realize your why, and it has to be centered around the why, or else the how kind of runs off on its own, and we can't remember why we started taking these actions to begin with because they're not centered on the why. And then the what is your process. What are you specifically doing? It is the result of the why, the proof. So again, if that how and the what, somehow we don't know why we're doing them anymore and we can't name what they're centered on, they're just things maybe we've always done for a long period of time, then we need to reevaluate them and make sure that they center back up on our why, or what are our core values as a congregation, the things that we value about why we are together in this community, and we need to center on those. I say all this now because this is a hard data set. Where you find yourself right now as Westminster Presbyterian Church is a tough place to be. And so I want you to hear me and know that while this is your story today, it does not have to be your story tomorrow as a congregation, but is going to take work of every person in your congregation that is intentional and concrete and takes you back, harkens back to the why of you as a congregation, and starts that center again, where people are willing to let go of some of the things you've struggled with in the past, some of the conflict that you've had that I can see in your data, and we start looking at what does Westminster look like starting today, and what do we dream for it to be, and how do we get there? So I say all this now because this is tough data, and I think there are things we want to keep in mind as we're going through. And one of the things is we can get to what your why is as you move forward, and that can be enormously helpful. I wanted to share with you that out of your responses, you had 67 responses of your average weekly attendance. And that is 89% of your average worship. So that's a really good response rate. I would have liked to have seen it a bit higher for a church your size, but this still is data that is meaningful and you can use to make decisions on. It's got a very low margin of error, so even if 100% of the folks that answered it would not move that much, and so that's helpful. So this is where you were in terms of your response rate. And we're going to start here by talking about two things we know that a congregation needs. They need satisfaction and energy. And when I'm talking about satisfaction, I'm not talking about that consumerism type of satisfaction. I'm talking about that sense of peaceful contentment when we're sitting in the pews with each other, when we're working alongside of each other outside of the pews. It is this feeling of belonging with those meaningful relationships that we're building. So past that handshake and beyond into those deeper relationships we can build with each other in Christ. It is a sense of fulfillment and wholeness and an absence of discord. So there isn't always this anxiety of this kind of, this is going to go wrong because there's going to be pushback on everything we do. And then energy is a compelling sense of purpose. It is passion with intention. It is why do we do what we do the way we do it at Westminster. It is not throwing a bunch of things against a wall and hoping something sticks and then going with that thing. We want to make sure that we can answer the question of that why, that's the center of our circles, right? Why are we doing this? So that the what and the how have clear purpose. So we need both of these things, satisfaction and energy, to have a vital, healthy congregation. So we're going to start by looking at these two things within your congregation. We asked your folks, on the whole, I am satisfied with how things are in our church. Now, if you remember, we had the responses on what's called the Likert scale. So for those folks who strongly agreed, we're calling that clear agreeance. For those folks who are on the fence, they tended to agree or tended to disagree. And so the responses say, yeah, well, kind of, or no, not really. And they're often waiting to see what's going to happen next, which could push them one way or another. And then clearly disagree, which is your strongly disagree or disagree. For your folks you had, when we asked this question about how satisfied folks are, 28% clearly agreed, 51% were on the fence, and 21% clearly disagreed. So when we look at this, you have, compared to what we typically see, this puts you at a low. So when we benchmark you against those other congregations, your level of satisfaction is low. Part of the reason for that is you have 51% of your folks on the fence. And I'm often asked, well, we're a church in pastoral transition. Could that play into this in any way? And the answer is no. You're being benchmarked. About 70% of the other churches we work with are in some kind of clergy transition. So that doesn't really play in very often to putting more folks on the fence and people waiting to see what happens. I would guess that folks were on the fence prior to your transition. And then you have 21% clearly disagree. So with 28% clearly agree and 21% clearly disagree, that's quite a disparity within your congregation, meaning folks are having a pretty different experience. And that can be a tough thing. So when we ask folks this question about satisfaction, it's lower than we typically see. And so this is something right away that we know needs some attention. The next thing we asked folks was a negatively framed question, and this is about that energy, that passion with intention I talked about before. And this asked, it seems to me we're just going through the motions of church activity. There isn't much excitement about it among our members. We had 22% clearly agree with this, which we don't want, right? 45% on the fence, and 33% clearly disagree. This puts you at a low average compared to those other congregations that you were benchmarked against. And again, the reason you're low, and it's average, but low average, is you have a lot of folks on the fence, 45%, and 33% clearly disagreeing, and 22% clearly agreeing. So again, a lot of folks kind of having very different experiences within your congregation. And when you have that kind of polarization, it's really hard to get things done because kind of folks over here are saying, I'm not happy with what's happening. And folks over here are saying, well, if you just get happy, we could do some good work together. And so it creates this polarization where it's really hard to get folks moving forward together. So your energy and satisfaction both are in that low or low average range. And so we're going to look at where that puts you on what we call our energy and satisfaction map. So we take your level of energy and your level of satisfaction, and we put you on this map in the quadrants here. And I want to talk a little bit about each of these quadrants and then show you where you are. Up at the top right is our high energy, high satisfaction quadrant, our transformational quadrant. This is where we want every congregation that we work with to be. And this is your high vitality congregations. We find that churches in this quadrant have exceptional worship that changes their lives and their beliefs and kind of their spiritual grounding. 99% of the time, they are externally focused, meaning they are not spending a lot of time on internal fixes that must happen, but they've got those kind of shored up, and they are able to strategically think about the folks they want to reach in terms of growth and the folks they want to reach in terms of ministry, understanding the difference between the two. We also find that transformational churches are extremely adaptable and flexible. And what I mean by that is they have the ability to stand with their congregation where they are, not where they think they are, and help the congregation move to where they're called to be. And that often can mean reassessing what we've been doing in terms of ministry, reassessing what we've been doing in terms of education. What do we need to think about in terms of worship if we really truly want to strategically reach folks with what we're doing? And being willing to reassess all of those things in a way where we let some things go that are no longer effective, but we really get down to what are the 3 things we need to do exceptionally well to achieve our purpose. Not what 20 things we want to do mediocrely or kind of okay, but the exceptionally well part. What are those things? And so transformational churches have been able to hone in on that and really work towards kind of making those things happen within their community and their congregation. Down at the bottom right, we have our static quadrant, or our low energy, high satisfaction quadrant. We find that churches here are pretty satisfied with how things are. They've been the way they've been for a long time. And they really aren't energized to do much different than they always have. And so we've called these churches often chaplaincies because really it's about for folks going to church. They can't imagine their church being any other way. Going to church, receiving what they have come to receive, and leaving. So it's not engaging. It's not necessarily something where we're trying new things. And honestly, unless these churches can figure out how to hone in on some new energy sources, these are the churches that will close their doors over time. And that time really just depends on how long people are willing to stay in that system, what their financial situation looks like, etc. Up at the top left is our high energy, low satisfaction quadrant, or what we call our chaos quadrant. We find that churches here are often pretty energized about a lot of different things. Some folks might be energized about the music, some folks might be energized behind a new ministry they're trying, some folks might be aligned behind a particular staff member, but things are pretty siloed. So there really isn't this sense that what we're all doing, even though they're different things, really still align us with that mission and vision of who we are. They are really getting down to that why in the center of our map, right? And so what we find is the siloing then creates oftentimes a competition for resources, be they human resources or financial resources, and then also building resources. So kind of it becomes this, well, we need people to help us over here. Why do we never get kind of what we need? And, folks over here saying, gosh, no one ever thanks us for what we do. It's kind of this lack of cohesiveness, but with high energy where folks are excited about the things that they are doing. We find that energy cannot last for long without that satisfaction of we're all working together towards a common goal here, even if we're doing different things. And so those congregations will often drop down into the reinvention or recovery quadrant. And this is where you all find yourself at this point in time at Westminster. And talk about drivers. Drivers are things that people are focused on in your congregation. They might not know they're focused on them, but there are things they're focused on to determine how satisfied and energized they are. So you may not know this, but when folks decide, how satisfied and energized am I at Westminster, they actually don't walk around and check and see that everything is running smoothly and then determine, yes, I am satisfied and energized. They actually look at a very small number of things to determine that. And we call those your drivers, or areas of focus. So for your folks at Westminster, the things that matter most to that energy and satisfaction levels, which we know are low or low average, are these. Folks are asking, is the education and formation opportunities that we offer, do they fit my complex lifestyle? Does the spirit of our congregation make people want to get as involved as possible? Do we do a good job helping members understand they are called to ministry? And does our clergy have a pastoral care plan for members who need extra care? So these are the things that people are thinking about when they're determining how satisfied and energized they are. And when folks determine these things are going well, when the answer to these questions is absolutely, this is happening, then their satisfaction and energy will go up. When they determine that these things are not going as well as they would like, then their satisfaction and energy will go down. And so when we kind of think about what are the things we want to pay attention to, these are some things we want to pay attention to within your congregation because they are the most likely to affect that satisfaction and energy level. And kind of to take this further on the next slide, we then make from that list I just gave you, those drivers, things people are looking at to determine how satisfied and energized they are, we make a list of critical success factors. So what are things that people are focused on, like our drivers, and that folks would like to see have some attention, meaning they need to be moving a little bit differently than they currently are. And so where we look here is down at the bottom, we have this chart, and if it's over 50, it's urgent. And you all didn't have anything urgent on this list, but these are things that we need to pay attention to. They're your low-hanging fruit successes, the things that if you at Westminster begin working on now during this transition time, will help you take next steps to becoming a healthier congregation. And then when you have your next good fit as a clergy person, that person will be able to help you take these things even further. And so there's nothing urgent, so nothing's on fire. If it's 35 to 50 on this chart, then it's important and probably should have been addressed a bit ago. But you do have some things that are 20 to 34, which are significant and need to be addressed in this next 6-month period. And so you can see here what this list is, but I put them out into a different chart for you all for this presentation. And so again, when we're thinking about critical success factors, it's what do we need to be working on now? And the first one is flexibility. When folks are things that people are focused on and are wanting to see move differently, one of those things is that you need to become a flexible system that is willing to make changes to our worship in order to reach people in your community. So something that needs to be done during this transition time is start thinking about, why are we not a flexible system? Is it because we've tried things in the past and they've failed and that's caused some anxiety in the system? Is it that we don't really have a plan when we do things and it feels too uncharted waters and we need to do better at having intentional concrete steps? So these are things we need to start talking about now as we're going through this transition time and start working on. The other thing folks are looking at that needs some attention is in your ministry and morale development. It's help members understand they are called to ministry and it is our spiritual call to engage in that work. One of the things we know about ministry is you can have some of the best ministry opportunities for folks available, but if folks don't understand they're called to do ministry, that it is a spiritual call, then you often have trouble getting folks engaged in your ministries. So if your ministries are clearly aligned with that why, like we talked about before, because your ministries are the what and the how, right, of that center why, if that is off track, then you need to look at your inventory in terms of ministry. But if it's on track, we need to make sure that folks understand they're called to ministry, and that will help get folks more engaged and excited about being a part of it. And then also, under this section, the folks are wanting the congregation to become a place that creates a spirit so that people want to get engaged and involved. When I look at your data, there's kind of this sense of disengagement at this point, and part of that's because of the conflict I see in your data, which is significant at this time. And so what happens in a culture like yours when there is conflict is oftentimes people will disengage. And so what folks are looking for is a way to create this spirit so that folks will want to become a part of something great you all are doing together. And then the last thing that folks really look at to determine how satisfied and energized they are that needs some attention and some time is pastoral care. They are looking for a clear pastoral care plan that is executed consistently and effectively. And we need to keep in mind at Westminster, though, that doesn't necessarily indicate that it needs to just be the clergy who does this. So you can have a clergy person who is excellent at strategic planning and excellent at preaching and teaching, and maybe not as good at the pastoral care piece, but you can still have a very vital congregation. The opposite is not true. You cannot have a clergy person who is just good at pastoral care and not as good at the preaching and teaching and strategic leadership and have a vital congregation. So what I mean when I say all that is you can have a clergy person who heads up a pastoral care plan, but really this is a time to start thinking about how you all can engage better in what that plan looks like, how you can help make it consistent and effective. Are we taking care of everyone within our congregation or just the folks that we know personally? And thinking about how that pastoral care plan can work well for everybody, not burn out your clergy person, and also be something that you carry on through any clergy transition that you have so that you're still caring for each other and still have that care plan in place. When we asked folks about what they wanted to see in the future in terms of priorities, you had 3 top priorities. The first 2 were very typical. They were about growth. So the first is create a comprehensive strategy to reach new people and incorporate them into the life of the congregation. Remembering this is 3 steps: comprehensive strategic plan to reach new people, and then incorporate them into the life of the church. Sometimes we forget that third part. We want to make sure once we get folks in, that we're giving them ways to connect meaningfully. The second one is also about growth, which is make necessary changes to attract families with children and youth. Again, this is an internally focused priority about bringing folks into the congregation, into the body. And then the third one, which is actually a unique one and to have so high, which is work to renew and revitalize the community around the church by building coalitions with partners that share this vision and commitment. Um, this one really speaks to the fact that there is an intentionality within your congregation to think about kind of what's outside your building and your community and how to make those connections work in a way that helps support your work, but also helps support the other folks that you could partner with out in the community. And this is an externally focused priority. I also always look at unusually high or notable priorities, and that first one here is what we just talked about on the previous page, is that working to renew and revitalize the community around the church is an unusually high one for you all, but for whatever reason, that's on your mind, and I think that's worth talking about more and capturing kind of what folks have in mind and using some creative thought about what that looks like. The other one that on the all of the 17 priorities that ran higher than I typically see was strengthen the pastoral response of the church in serving people. If you remember, that also came up on your critical success factors, or things that people need to focus on, or that focus on to determine how satisfied and energized they are. And here it's coming up as a priority as well. So there's something that folks are longing for in the way that there is a pastoral response of what's happening either between folks, from the clergy to folks, whatever that looks like within your system, that folks really want to come up with a better plan as you move forward, which we talked about a couple slides ago. The next part I want to talk about is your congregational culture. We can spend all day strategizing and talking about a good plan, but if we don't heed to culture and pay attention to what your congregational culture is, it all may be for naught. And the favorite line is, culture eats strategy for lunch. It's very popular, but it doesn't have to. If we're mindful of what the culture is, and we learn how to lean into the healthy side of the culture, the strengths, and stay accountable to the shadow sides of what our culture is. So it's really important that we do both. So, in terms of flexibility, you need to know that this is one area that you have to begin intentionally working on, because you're going to have a new clergy person come in at some point. They are not going to be able to make a lot of changes very quickly with you all. That is true. They're going to have to take very slow, concrete, intentional steps. But the problem here is, even with that, there's going to be tension because we are so settled in this system. And being a settled system comes from lots of different things. It could be anxiety of things that has happened over time. It could be a pattern of learning that you all have had where, over time you've had ideas and folks have pushed back so much that everyone's just decided to not we're just kind of stuck here. But we've got to get out of that feeling of stuckness and start strategically moving forward together. And that's going to take everyone in the congregation. And it's also going to take holding each other accountable when you have friends who are pushing back on ideas. There are things that we can try that will not hurt us substantially. We can make some attempts at some changes without giving up everything and be all in and willing to push forward. And we need to start doing some of that at Westminster. The other thing I wanted to say is being so settled can ultimately end up with this, which is where your PNC is saying, basically, we're looking for an innovative pastor with a fresh vision who will inspire our church to remain exactly the same, which isn't what we want to do and not what we're called to do. We're called to continually grow together and to continue to kind of find Christ in each other and find Christ in the work that we're doing. So I want to take a minute, though, and talk about the Paraclete culture and what that means. Paraclete is a word that comes from the book of John. It means there are lots of words for it, but it means healer, advocate, Holy Spirit moving about us. So it really has a focus of healing and kind of being someone who stands up for people who need help. So the strengths of the Paraclete culture, so when things are operating at its best in Westminster, or it's able to develop communities that are intellectually open and reflective, but that pays attention to structure and ritual. So we understand kind of when we talk about our faith, when we when we have these discussions, we're open to kind of different ways of thought about it. We love conversation about our faith, kind of different ideas we might have, but we understand when we come together in a service or we come together and pray, there is a structure and a ritual that we have together. It is common to hear folks talk about hospitality, inclusiveness, and spiritual practice. This kind of culture is uniquely equipped to focus on ministries of healing. Often, you find in Paraclete cultures that they really are out doing a lot of that hand-to-hand healing work where they're serving food, helping folks do backpacks for schools. I mean, it's a very warm, healing kind of idea in terms of ministry, and folks are just driven to do it in this culture, which is different than the other congregational cultures. In the Paraclete culture, there's this drive to be hospitable. There is this drive to kind of get out there and do ministries that heal folks and help make them well in all kinds of ways, mentally, physically, socially, economically. And then the Paraclete culture, when it's operating at its best, prepares members to deal with the harshness of culture and political realities well. So oftentimes we find that in this culture, they're able to talk about kind of when we go out into the community, they're not going to have the same mindset we have or the same, they might not have the money we have. They might not look the way we do. They might not have experienced life the way we have. And we need to be sensitive to that and understand that as we do ministry with folks that we're picking to do ministry for. So those are the strengths, the great strengths of the Paraclete culture. Some of the shadow sides, so these are things that are easy to slip into if we don't hold each other accountable, are in a Paraclete culture, if missional focus is lost, you may find yourself going through the motions of set routines rather than finding the deeper meaning. And I want to combine that with the second one is you have to watch the temptation to overcommit to meeting the needs of others to the extent that there's burnout. And what this means is that oftentimes in a Paraclete culture, we find ourselves, because we're driven to that healing ministry, we find ourselves committing to a lot of ministries or a lot of programming. And it comes from a good place. It's because maybe someone had a great idea and other folks thought it was a good idea. And so we started this ministry and it worked for a while. But over time, because we've added on another ministry over here, and oftentimes you have churches that had hundreds of people before who are now down to 100 or less, and they're still doing the same amount of ministries they always did without really assessing, are they still really centered on our why, of who we are as a congregation, in a way that we can do them exceptionally well. And so we end up with lots of ministries, trying to find people to engage in them. It's often the same people doing them with a high level of burnout. And so it's always important in a Paraclete culture to realign with your mission and vision, kind of why do we do what we do the way we do it idea, and make sure that our ministries are doing that exceptionally well. So if we don't have that, then we need to start thinking about what do we need to let go at this time. It also can be easy in the Paraclete culture to get trapped in acceptance of where people are without adequate levels of accountability that can help make people whole. So one of the ideas behind the Paraclete culture is it is this healing culture. It is this culture of acceptance and hospitality, but it also can't just allow folks to behave however they want to behave. We have to have accountability when we're in relationship. And so if people become too comfortable being a certain way, and we're not holding them accountable to what it looks like to be a part of our community, then we start to kind of fracture, we start to have cliques, we start to kind of break apart. And then the last one is that the power of the gospel to transform has to remain a focus. It's not just the power to comfort. So always keeping in mind spirituality is about really not just comforting us, but it's also about transforming us and calling us to action. So we want to make sure that we're hearing both in the work we do. So the next part I want to talk about is how you're doing in terms of performance indices. And these are areas where we want you to be doing well. And then we will talk at the end of this a little bit more about kind of some of the strengths you can leverage through this time. I will tell you the data in a lot of these areas is a bit deflated. And again, I'll talk at the beginning of this section about why I think that is. But just quickly, in this area, when we're benchmarking as to whether your data responses were very low all the way to very high compared to those other 2,200 other churches. And so if the score is from 0 to 10, this is just an example here, this is not yours, but if the score is from 0 to 10, it's very low. If it's 10 to 30, it's low. 30 to 70 is average. 70 to 90 is high. 90 to 100 is very high. Okay, so we're going to be looking at dashboards like this throughout some pages here, and I want you to just keep this scoring in mind, but I will tell you on each page too kind of what you're looking at. So the first two sections that I want to talk about are your scores in conflict management and governance. Conflict management is really not about, do we have conflict in our congregation? Every congregation has conflict, I promise you. It's really more about how we manage it. And so we ask folks these questions on the left. Is there a disturbing amount of conflict in our congregation? Do we resolve our problems through mutual effort? Among most of our members, is there a healthy tolerance of differing opinions and beliefs? And is there frequently a small group that opposes what the majority want to do? For governance, that's really about your trust in leadership. Do we trust the leaders? Are they transparent when they make decisions? Do we feel represented in the leadership? And we ask specifically on the right, do leaders show genuine concern for what people are thinking when decisions need to be made? Do this same small group of people make most of the decisions? So not just a small group, that's your polity, you have a session, but whether or not it's the same folks all the time. In important decisions, is there adequate consideration of different approaches provided? And is the leadership representative of the membership? So when we look at your scores and how your congregation responded, if you remember, from 0 to 10 is low, from 10 to 0 to 10 is very low, 10 to 30 is low. So for both of your scores in terms of conflict management and governance, you have low scores. And the concern here is that not only is your conflict management score low, meaning there's conflict that you're experiencing currently, your trust in leadership is even lower, which makes it very hard for you all to work through conflict because you don't really have leaders that you feel are listening, are being transparent, and are representative of the membership. And this can cause even more conflict if they are trying to lead you through times of conflict. So one of the things that I had suggested to your leadership is that you do some significant conflict management work and leadership development as a congregation, so that you can commit to move forward together in a healthier way and deal with the things that have happened in the past or currently, but also learn tools to move forward together, because you're always going to run into something. It might not be the same thing, but it's going to be something. And you all, as a system, really have to learn how to move through conflict if you really want to continue to be a healthy congregation together. That's your commitment. The next section is your hospitality scores. And this is us, again, asking your congregation to look at, what is your temperature with each other and with new people coming in to be a part of your congregation. And we asked, are we welcoming and enriched by people from many different walks of life? Has being a part of this church community given new meaning to my life? Do I sense a friendly atmosphere among the members of our church? In times of personal need, do I sense an atmosphere of genuine care and concern? And have members been prepared to personally welcome guests in worship services? So again, when we look at where you fall on the benchmarking, it's in the 15th percentile, which means that that's low compared to what we typically see. And what this indicates to me is that you have had enough conflict for long enough that it has affected how you feel about your care, how you feel about that friendly atmosphere among each other, how you feel about being welcoming to other people. And this will hit you hard in the area of growth because folks will be able to feel that conflict when they come into your congregation. And so this needs to be kind of a way to look at kind of how that conflict you've had is kind of hitting all of your other performance areas pretty hard. This section looked at your readiness for ministry and your educational engagement. Your readiness for ministry looked at whether or not folks feel called to be a part of ministry, if there's a good gift discernment process to help folks determine what's a good fit for them, if there are opportunities for ministry that folks can engage in that are meaningful, and whether or not the church does a good job reminding folks that they are making a difference when they are in ministry. And again, this is in the 13th percentile, so it's in the low range compared to what we typically see. Again, when I talked about your paraclete culture, and I said earlier before we even talked about that, one of the things that happens in the paraclete culture when there is conflict, people disengage. They become frustrated and they disengage. And I think this is coming out here as well, where folks just aren't feeling called. They just don't want to engage in the opportunities that are available. I don't know the whole story. That's your story, but that's what the data looks like to me. The education and engagement, engagement and education asks questions, again, whether folks understand they are called to lifelong learning of spirit and spiritual formation, whether we are offering the opportunities that fit in their complex lifestyles, and whether or not we're doing it quality education for all ages and stages of life. Again, this is 31 percentile, so that's in the average range, the low average range, but it is an average. Again, you're going to have less engagement with conflict for paraclete cultures because they will just not want to be a part of the system's programming if they're feeling that conflict at a level that's too frustrating. Spiritual vitality is our next one. These questions were very personalized. They looked at, how God is moving in their day-to-day life, if they experience faith in all aspects of their life, if there are other things more pressing in their life right now. This was very low for you all in the 1 percentile. And part of that could be, and I think it is, the conflict that you're experiencing and the lack of hospitality with each other often can bleed into kind of how folks view their relationship with God. And that can be really tough. The other caveat I have for this one is more progressive congregations tend to have lower spiritual vitality, but not quite this low. But it does play into it a bit. But again, folks just aren't experiencing that day-to-day walk with God and the way we would like to see. And I think part of that plays out when we look at the data, plays out in the fact that folks are feeling that kind of the home, their spiritual home, which is your church, is not in a healthy place either. Worship and music was by far your best area. Your music performed in the high range on its own. And so folks really do find great meaning and joy in the worship. In the music. And the worship is actually in the average range. So folks, this is one area where you all are doing well, is this music and worship. What I think is good is that means that when folks come to worship and music, they're able to set aside all of those other things we just talked about that. But in terms of the conflict, in terms of their lack of trust and leadership, we want to make sure, though, we're able to take whatever folks are learning from worship and music and apply it to how they deal with conflict and how they work with each other and all of those other pieces that are so very, very important. Let's talk about clergy transition for a minute. So there are 3 parts to a successful pastoral transition. The first part is a transition plan, or what we call a ready church. And these are the things that you do as a congregation during transition time to ensure that you're a healthy system, you're working on things that need attention, that you keep the islands of health and the good programming that you have going, and that you look at any things that you want to spend some time reevaluating so that you're ready for that next new pastor when they come in. The second part is a search plan. And this, what I mean by this isn't just the PNC, but really thinking about, and I'm sorry, this says right rector, but what the right pastor for you all looks like. And who that person is, what their resume needs to look like, what their history with other churches needs to look like, and kind of what it is that their skill sets bring to you that you need, and what you all bring to that clergy person that they need. And then lastly, you need a startup plan. So once that new pastor comes, you are handing off things in a way that allows that new person to have some low hanging fruit successes fairly quickly and very limited surprises on the part of your clergy, meaning they know who you are, who you really are, not just kind of who you say you are, but what are all the things underneath that we haven't addressed that need worked on, and you know who that clergy person is. So these things need to all be happening in a way that sets you up for a successful transition. During transition times, we always have to ask as a system, what happens to our congregation's ministries? We want to think about how do we want people to feel during this time of transition? We certainly don't want them to feel anxious. And what are we going to do to keep that from happening? What do we want people to be saying? We don't want people to be constantly complaining about how long it's taking to find the person. We want people to be saying, we are taking our time to find the next good fit for us so that we can head forward in a vital way. We are going to be complimenting people and thanking them for their service and things like that. And how will we treat each other? What are some thoughtful things we need to be doing for each other during this time of transition, understanding that indeed it is anxiety producing no matter what? And what do we want leadership to experience? And what do we want leadership to be doing? So what does transparency look like during this time? What does leadership look like during this time? How does the congregation feel represented during these times? These are things we want to be thinking about. When I look at your data, the things that I think you need to be looking at during this transition time are beginning to work on solid leadership development and best practices. I think something that's happened in your congregation for whatever reason, there's been a chasm between the leadership and the congregation, and there's a very low lack of trust. And it's really important then to start looking at how do we develop leaders? How do we determine people are called to the ministry of leadership? And then what are some leadership best practices that we can use as we move forward? You need to begin working on how you deal with conflict within your congregation. As far as I can tell from the data, there's a lot of conflict that's happened. It could be several different things, but this is a time where you really need to start looking at it, because if you don't, and I hope you hear me, you will continue to lose people in your congregation. And so if this isn't something that we're willing to deal with, then we just need to make the decision that we know this is kind of where we're going to be stuck then. So this is something that as a congregation, you really need to think about how you're going to move forward and learn how to deal with conflict. Oftentimes the best way to do that is to have someone who is a facilitator in that kind of work come in, a third party who doesn't have any skin in the game on either side. But if that's not possible for you all, then you're going to need to think of some other creative solutions to start having those meaningful conversations and the healing pieces that happen then. And then you should start examining your current ministry programming, including how you spiritually talk about ministry. So kind of ministry is what we're spiritually called to do, and why are we called to do that? I think it's important to look at and talk about how you look at gift discernment. So how are you putting people in places where they're blessed and a blessing, and celebrate the work you do once you do it. And I think you get, and again, I said this before, need to examine and reframe how you think about pastoral care. So you always want to be thinking about, when you're thinking about ministry, and ministry includes being in leadership, what are your gifts? What do you have to bring? How can you bring them? And you're thinking personally, like kind of how do I engage on a personal level, but corporately, meaning within the congregation. And how am I going to give them away? To whom rather, and when? So really starting to think about, what do I have to bring to the table? And then how am I going to do this in a healthy way, give them away, when and to whom is that going to happen? The next part in that healthy transition plan is a search. This is a search piece I talked about. And so when I looked at your data, what I see is a need for experience. So not a new young pastor right out of theology school, but someone who has experience working particularly with the system, that has had some struggles and has a long history of some conflict issues. You want someone who can create strong congregational leadership models. So someone who is probably a really good strategic leader who has on their resume the ability to rebuild leadership models or strengthen leadership models that existed when they came to their last several churches or last church. They're going to need to be able to preach and teach on the more progressive side of the theological perspective. That's just where you all are, and that's going to be important for them to be able to speak to. They're going to have to be able to teach and model healthy conflict management. So we're going to need someone who has an experience of dealing with conflict at a level that where it's kind of been avoided for a while and not dealt with in a healthy way, and is able to come in and help move that forward. Someone here too that has an understanding of healing and accountability that will be necessary to move forward. So it's okay to have conflict and then try to work it out, but there is a point where we have to say, okay, we're going to now let this go, and we're going to have kind of a healing service or whatever that person decides to lead with, and then accountability to say, we're not going to talk about this anymore. So if someone's in the parking lot talking about it, you say, come on, we're moving on. And then someone who helps you understand how to build staff and fine-tune ministry work. So how to build it effectively, how to staff it, and that can be volunteer staffs or actual staff folks, and then fine-tune ministry work. So you're not doing too many things, but the things that you're doing exceptionally well. The strengths you have to leverage during this time of transition are you're a paraclete culture. We talked about that. There's lots of good strengths in that movement to want to do hand-to-hand healing. You have an inclusive nature to you. There's a strong desire in your congregation for pastoral care and meeting the needs of people that shows a compassion and empathy there. All age groups in your congregation are focused on ministry. So when we break down your priorities by age, everyone had ministry pretty strong in their data, and that's really good. So you have a lot of folks on the same page about where you want to head. And you have an excellent music program. So that is something where you're finding connection with God and with each other, and there are ways you can leverage that to kind of help you move through this time. So really, it just comes down to all of the things I just said. And I will end with this. Again, I'm talking to you in the middle or probably early stages of the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that church, and I work with churches all the time, but I believe church and congregations are going to be more vital than ever as we come out of this time. And this is a really good time to ask yourselves as a congregation, who are we in the world? What is our preferred future? Are we ready to be fierce learners to get there? And if you take some time and really start working on these things now, I think you'll be surprised at how much God will work with you all and in through you all. So that's what I wanted to leave you with today. And again, this is your data set today. This does not have to be your story tomorrow. And I am hopeful that you all will prayerfully take on this data, really come to some solid, healthy next steps, and I am excited to hear about where you go. Thank you for working with us, and I wish you many blessings. Please stay safe and stay healthy.